Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with Ann Neumann, who is a journalist and the author of the book, The Good Death: An Exploration of Dying in America. I think you'll find this wide-ranging conversation to be fascinating. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel down below if you haven't done so already. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review for the End of Life University podcast, wherever you happen to listen. And if you're so inclined and you can make a small contribution to help keep this channel and the podcast on the air, you can go to eoluniversity.com/support. You'll find 3 different ways there you can make just a very small contribution that will help keep this going. So thanks in advance if you choose to do that. And now we'll move on with my conversation with Ann Neumann. Today, I'm so very happy to welcome my guest, Ann Neumann. Ann is a journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's Magazine, The Baffler, Guernica Magazine, where she's a contributing nonfiction editor, and elsewhere. Ann is the author of the book, The Good Death: An Exploration of Dying in America, which was the January selection for a year of reading dangerously this year. And so we have this opportunity to talk to Ann right now. I have the opportunity, and I'm very excited to talk about her book and the things she learned in the process of writing it. And you can learn more about Ann's work and the book at her website, anneumann.wordpress.com. And Ann is spelled with 2 N's. Anneumann, lots of N's in your name. So Ann, thank you for joining me and welcome.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, your book begins at where I imagine in many ways your journey may have begun on this topic of exploring the good death, with caring for your father at his end of life. And I was wondering if you would talk to us a little bit more about that experience for you and what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on, right? Clearly I did. I wrote a book about it, but you're absolutely right. Many of us who come to be advocates, or at least interested parties in end-of-life care, do so through the loss of a loved one, whether it's a partner, but most commonly a parent. And so my father was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma 10 years before we knew that he was actively dying. He tried various treatments. Prednisone gave him a great boost in the last year of his life, but he ultimately said to the doctor that he didn't want to try yet another drug with 5% efficacy, and that he wanted to go home with hospice. And we kind of thought that that meant he would go home and lie down and tell us he loved us and all of the past frictions and baggage, or luggage in this case, would be examined or put aside, and then he would close his eyes and stop breathing. And I think that impression was very much helped by the fact that we no longer see the dying process in our homes, certainly, but we also don't in media representation, and so we have very little understanding of how people die. That is not how it went down, and it was pretty hard on me. I was obviously an adult. This was in 2005, so I should have had a better understanding of what his end weeks and days and months, I guess, were going to look like. But everything was unresolved. There was this, friction between me and my sister. She had 2 young children. I was single. And care became a proxy for love, and food and money. All of these things became proxies for the very limited attention of this individual when he was alive and wealthy, or I'm sorry, healthy, not wealthy, but also when in his dying. And so it was awful. It was awful. And I know a lot of people have it much worse. The not knowing, the inability to grapple with resources, not knowing how to go about it. At least we were able to get hospice. My father had a will. My sister and I were still speaking. We just weren't tight friends. And so we muddled through. But after about a year and a half, I realized that I was still so angry. And I hope that this comes out in the book, the anger that it left me with. And we can talk about complicated grief and the damage that it can do, not just in familial relations, but I don't know, management of finances and work expectations and all of that. Complicated grief is really pernicious. But after about a year and a half of trying to figure it out on my own, I kind of put my reporter's hat on and said, I've got to go. I've got to talk to people. And so I started calling up anybody I could. I went to every conference possible. I became a hospice volunteer. I started taking on patients and thinking more globally about the end of life experience. And I was constantly matching up their experience with my own. And so it took me to hospice doctors, bioethicists, nurses, hospice caregivers, loved ones of the dying. When the book came out, what was most extraordinary, and I hadn't anticipated this, but what was most extraordinary for me was standing across the table from someone who brought me a copy of the book and asked me to sign it. But what they really brought me was their story. And they just wanted someone to hear them and to see them. And I realized that that's what my book, if I'm lucky, has done. It's allowed people who are in the midst of this kind of terror and intense labor and gendered labor and invisibility in many cases. It allowed them to be seen, I hope. And that was really rewarding. But yes, I did start with Dad. And I hope that that makes the book much more accessible. I think many of these books are written by doctors and not lay people who are left to founder through the subject matter themselves.
Yes, and one thing that stood out to me that you wrote about is not being prepared for what the dying process really looks like, for, as you said, the terror of it in a way. And it really concerns me that you had a hospice staff involved, that even the hospice staff did not prepare you well for what your dad might go through and what that might be like for you as a caregiver to take care of him.
Right. Well, there are a number of social and cultural, and I'd say systemic forces that come to bear on this intersection of healthcare and end of life care. And so hospice caregivers, whether they're in a facility or in the home, are still members of their local community. And so they bring with them, their own concerns and taboos and cultural impressions, just like doctors as well. Doctors are, not all hanging out in one great, a break room in the great hospital of America having one conversation. We tend to think of healthcare, because it is so opaque. We tend to think of healthcare as this unified, homogenous group, and it's not. So I think that's what was taking place. I was in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, at the southern end of the county, which is very close to the Mason-Dixon line. Religion is still quite prevalent there and everywhere around the deathbed. And there were just assumptions made about what was and was not to be said in polite company. I think maybe too, the caregivers were taking cues from us that, we didn't know what was going on. They didn't want to scare us. And I think all of that is understandable, but not acceptable, right? Like, we have to have caregivers who also know how to relate to the loved ones that surround the patient. And I feel very strongly that we need to change the way that we discuss death and dying. People have been talking about this forever. Have the conversation. And yet those conversations tend to be held without experience in many cases, or to focus around some of the easier topics like after death issues, right? I see the what's it called, death-friendly movement, Caitlin Dowdy and the Order of the Good Death folks, and that's fantastic. But the corpse can quite often be a mask, for the death and dying experience when we're dealing with live patients. That's where all the character and complications come in. So yeah, I think that maybe as a society, we haven't emboldened our hospice caregivers and doctors, and maybe we need to give them more space to step outside of the social milieu that they exist in, and to be quite matter of fact about, the signs of death when it's coming. What's the first thing that anyone asks you? How long does he have? Well, we don't know, but there are signs, and we'll stay with you until we see them. We'll tell you everything that we're experiencing, and that's just not said.
And you pointed out later in the book about there's marketing happening around hospice services. Well, all of healthcare. There's a lot of
Yes.
marketing happening, and there tends to be images of butterflies and rainbows and flowers and holding hands, and the sweet and gentle and beautiful side of the dying process. And I mean, not to say that in marketing they should show graphically the reality of it, but we should acknowledge we're marketing hospice in a very gentle way to help people feel more accepting and careful about it. But in some regards, that becomes dishonest if we are not fully training them and teaching them about what may happen.
Absolutely, Karen. I mean, we have put death behind curtains now, and it was helpful, for me in the book, to write about a period in time not so long ago where taking care of a dying person was a task of the women at home. Again, deeply gendered labor, right? But these then, taking care of the corpse, and all of the functions of the body, how these things happened were once quite well known to general public. Children would have seen them take place. But here we are in this moment where we've forgotten. We kind of need like a Girl Scouts for death and dying again. Teach us how to make the butter. Teach us how to build a fire.
It's so true because, medicine took over the dying process and kind of subsumed it in a way, but then screwed it up as far as I'm concerned. Brought it into the hospital, did too much, and in some ways stopped caring about the actual process of what's happening, stopped caring for the patient in a way. And so now we're trying to reclaim dying from the medical system, which has, I don't think, made anything any better. And so it's like we're starting from scratch again.
Right. Well, we know that hospice comes out of people observing that doctors lost interest after whatever ailed a patient could no longer be cured. And so these patients had no one to attend to them. That intense focus on their body and their concerns switched to the next patient as soon as they were deemed uncurable. And so hospice should exist in the space where patients can receive whatever palliative treatments will keep them comfortable. I mean, that comfort should be paramount. But the medical community just never really came around to that, which I'm so glad. I mean, it's such an honor to talk to hospice doctors because because medicine seems to have left this point in life behind. So you're a rare breed, and I really appreciate.
It's interesting because I
was just going to say
ahead.
one thing quickly before we leave what we were saying about medicine abandoning the patient. But I wanted to say that hospice is changing so much right now with for-profit hospices coming in. And while I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in this conversation, because all of medicine is for-profit at the moment, right? Even hospitals, they call themselves nonprofit, but they're writing off any charity, even they're writing off any charity that they can. Even Catholic hospitals, which I write quite a bit about, write off any charity that they provide. Only like 11% is from donation. The rest of it is from federal and state government. So the for-profit movement, and we can go back into that later if we want, but not only is the structure of medicine and training, isolating patients or abandoning patients after they can't be cured. But also then this financial model of medicine is an impediment to how people receive end-of-life care.
It's so very true. And I was remembering back in medical school when if we had a patient in the hospital on our service who was, sometimes they came in for a diagnostic workup. And when that patient was found to be terminal, they were no longer a teaching patient. And the residents explained to us, there's nothing to learn from those patients now. We'll move on to someone that we can learn something from, which at the time I didn't know any better, but later I was horrified to think of that no wonder none of us learned anything about a patient facing their own end of life and the dying process because they weren't considered good teaching cases.
Right.
And it's really horrible. I honestly, I hope that is changing now. And I think there's more awareness and more attention given, especially in some programs, to patients at the end of life.
Yeah, I think you bring up two things in my mind. First of all, there may be nothing to learn, but also there's nothing to gain with one's time, right? Hospice was set up to receive Medicare, Medicaid funding through the federal government in, what is it, 1984? Is that right?
I think that's correct. Yeah.
And so the provision that curative treatment must end when one enters hospice requires that stop. I mean, even the use of volunteers is the attempt was to keep end of life costs lower. And I'm not saying that's the whole ethos of hospice, but it was very much as the government saw the program and established it under the federal and state payment rubric. It was to keep the cost down. But also, I'm fascinated, if there's nothing to learn from individuals who are dying, who can no longer be cured, why is the mean stay in hospice a 6-month program? One can spend 6 months of their end days with hospice. Why is the mean stay these days still only around 7, probably a little higher in the past year or so? That's because no one wants to talk about what's taking place, either with patients or with their loved ones. So I worked at an in-hospital hospice facility, and sure enough, this was the place that patients were taken when new beds were needed. You know, they were kept upstairs in whatever services until the beds were needed up there. And of course, we all know the pay scale that those bed placements mean or determine. That's a real tragedy of medicine in my mind. The patients who are receiving treatment after treatment and not really being told that those treatments have little to no chance of saving their life.
Yeah, a failure to be transparent and to discuss openly and realistically what to expect from treatments that are being offered, and to simply rely on hope. Well, here's your hope. We can do another treatment. We can do another clinical trial. We'll offer you this. And to offer this false hope instead of factual information it's so tragic, because the patient can't make a reasonable choice for themselves if they don't know what the reality is.
Yeah. Do you have any solutions? I mean, how do we get doctors to start talking about this? My number one guess, I guess I'll start this question off, would be to start training doctors how to have these conversations. Just start that.
Absolutely. Training doctors have conversations, and maybe even all the way back at the selection process for medical school, to start screening, to start asking questions like, have you had any experiences with death in your personal life? And what are your thoughts about death? Because that's going to be part of your training, and to introduce it right from day one, so that medical students have a chance to start thinking and processing and learning about it, instead of shutting that information out because I'm not here to learn about that. That doesn't matter.
Right. I keep saying, and no one's taken me up on this. No one finds this interesting, but I think it would do a world of good, and it would be completely free to medical schools they could require that all medical students be a hospice volunteer, 1 semester, 1 year. It would be so simple. It would booster hospice volunteerism. It would give these individuals the experience so they don't wait until they're interns before they see a corpse or a dying patient. And I think that it alone would transform the profession, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few programs are making hospice care an elective or palliative care as an elective,
Yeah.
but only a few students I think would probably choose it just because they don't know any better. It doesn't
Yeah.
seem interesting to them. They almost have to be forced into taking those classes. But I worked with a hospice nurse once who said, if only when doctors are explaining treatment options to patients, if they had the last column would always be no treatment, that here are all these treatments we can do, and another option is no treatment. And there might be a day when we decide that that's the best thing to do, is to
Mm.
not offer treatment, just because that puts the idea in the patient's mind that it isn't that the only thing possible here is that I get some sort of treatment or another. It's that no treatment can also be a choice, and may be the best choice at times.
Yeah, you're more patient than I am. I want something much more overt, but I hear you. I hear you. Just
Yeah.
because we know families are, what, 4 million people die a year. Is that about right? Certainly the number is much higher in this current moment where we have extra deaths because of the pandemic. But, and I guess we can say gun deaths as well. But um, I think the thing that has impressed me in this time of watching both patients and loved ones is that they're still shocked that science doesn't have all the answers. Just why doesn't the doctor know what I am sick with? Why doesn't the doctor have a drug that doesn't make me sick? How come the doctor doesn't know I'm already on these 5 medications? How, just this belief that medicine and science can answer all questions. And when you realize that it really doesn't, that is a terribly scaring event.
It's true. It is a sort of magical thinking in a way, that there's magic in the science itself, which is,
Yeah.
science is supposed to be purely rational and not magical, but there's
Yeah.
magical thinking about the science. And sometimes even doctors are subject to that, and they
Yeah.
believe so much in the treatments that they offer that they stay in denial about this simple reality that we will all die one day. And
Yeah.
I remember saying that at a talk I was giving, that, every one of the patients that you're caring for will die. And
Mm.
even the ones whose lives you saved today or last week, they'll still die. And so for you to think otherwise is foolish, because you will one day be severely disappointed and crushed that this person you worked so hard to save didn't make it.
Right. You make me think of that old study where when doctors are discussing what end of life treatments or care they want, they're like, do no more, right? If it's not going to cure me, I don't want futile treatment. And I think it's like 75% higher than the general public. The general public's like, please do everything I want to live, as though that's an option. And doctors are like, oh no, we know how this goes down. We will say no to all of the treatment and all of the suffering and all of the delay in accepting the fact that we're going to die, if indeed it is our time.
And that should be so telling to people who look at that statistic, that, oh, the people offering these treatments would not choose them for themselves. Very interesting.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And you pointed out another issue, that some patients on hospice live longer than their prognosis, longer than they were expected to, which I saw happen over and over again. And it really seemed that it was because they moved out of this curative realm, and they were kind of in a different space and receiving this attentive compassionate care and focusing on other things about life and death. And yet sometimes hospices get punished if patients live too long, as if they have inappropriately admitted patients. And we know that kind of fraud does happen. But what a conundrum it is then that we're being asked in a way to work against ourselves, because if our patient does live longer, then we may get in trouble for that.
Yeah, I opened the book with my father, of course, but also with Evelyn. I have to remember her pseudonym, Eleanor. Eleanor's been dead a number of years now, so I think I can use her name. But she was a doctor, and she was admitted into hospice right away. She had lung cancer, and she was like, "Oh no, I understand what this means. I'm going home." And she went home, and I was with her for 5 years as a volunteer. 5 years. And of course, because of her connections and her money, and this was the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and the recertification process was relatively straightforward for her. But yes, studies say patients can have as much as 3 months longer of their life if they go into hospice. And it's not giving up after all. Yeah, it's really
And then
astounding.
again, it doesn't quite make sense if doctors are offering treatment after treatment in hopes of extending someone's life, that they're missing that very important fact
Yeah,
and statistic that it's possible that choosing that no treatment column is the one thing that would give their patient more time.
absolutely. Yeah. But I think it's very hard to give up, as we phrase it, right? It's very hard to accept. I've had hospice nurses tell me, but if she doesn't eat, about a patient, if she doesn't eat, she will lose her strength. I had one patient in the book where he was in an all HIV facility, and staff were hesitant to give him methadone as a treatment for pain, because they were afraid of its addiction properties. And I said, but he's dying. So this understanding of how we treat the living and the dead tends to blur. And it's very hard to accept the fact we're in the habit of living, right? We're in the habit of treating people as though we will continue living.
So true. So true. Well, I'm curious about just all about writing this book, because you did extensive research on many different topics, and it appeared that you had to travel quite a lot to meet with people and interview people. So I'm just curious about how long it took you to write the book, and what inspired you to go into various topics and learn more.
I don't know. I think the only thing that carries me through a writing career is curiosity. So issue after issue kind of revealed itself to me over time. The aid in dying movement is something I spend extensive amount of time on. In the book, I go out to Montana, where the Supreme Court had just made a decision to, they took a case by a man named Robert Baxter. And the Supreme Court decided that there was nothing in the Montana state constitution that prevented aid in dying from being legal. I was fascinated by Catholic or faith in healthcare. When you imagine what it means to have 1 in 5 hospital beds in the United States governed by the Catholic Church. They're the largest provider of healthcare in the country after the VA, Veterans Affairs. I write about disability as well, because all of these questions were coming to me from the outside. Once I started pulling the thread about end of life concerns, it took me through all of these fascinating, complicated places. And so the book tends to be pretty ambitious in kind of the scale, the breadth of areas surrounding end of life care that I delve into, and hopefully with a strong and compelling character in each book. So yes, the writing process for me was really being kind of meticulous about my interviews and reports and studies that I came by, not at the beginning necessarily because I wanted to write a book, but really just I wanted to write an article. And the article that started this book was, I was thinking about Terry Schiavo case, which coincided pretty much with my father's death. She died in the spring, as we know, and he died in the fall, and in December, actually, in the winter. But the news, she was all over the news, and I was thinking about this idea of force feeding, which would be another way to discuss physiological support received by, or life support received by persistent vegetative state patients, as Schiavo was diagnosed. And I wondered, where else in society can one be force-fed against their will, which takes us, like if as the courts decided, Schiavo would not have wanted to live on in perpetuity on a feeding tube. And so it took me to find cases in prison where patients are being force-fed. And there's a lot of fantastic academic scholarship that looks at the social and environmental familiarities between, say, prison or incarceration and hospitalization, right? There's kind of an overlap, but also to bring in this religious thread then as well, like ideas of authority and decision-making, and those sorts of properties. So it was really exciting to me to learn something about both areas by putting them next to each other. So I wrote about a guy named Bill Coleman, who was just messaging me on Facebook this morning. He was released from prison. He is alive and well now, but at one point in his life, he was not eating anything but fluids for a very long time. He lost a bunch of his teeth. He's an unsavory character, I will say. He was incarcerated for raping his wife, and he believes in men's rights, and fascinating individual. But it allowed me to think about seemingly similar treatments, right, that forced feeding in these various settings. So I published that piece at Guernica magazine, and I was kind of off and running. I realized that these issues were interesting to people my age and younger, but also, many of us were grappling with this with our parents and others in our lives, and so I just kept going. I got a grant from the Luce Center. I was working at NYU as an administrator at the Center for Religion and Media, and so I was keying into a lot of religion issues as it involved U.S. policy and legislation. And so it was a great place to foster the work that I was doing. $10,000 grant. So it covered travel, but certainly not labor. And then I was putting in my biography at the end of any article that I wrote that I was writing a book about death and dying. And I had agents start to contact me. And I went with one of them. We put a book proposal together, and I had been working for quite a while on this research. And we sold the book to Beacon Press, a fantastic editor there, Amy Caldwell, that I adore. I mean, you'll have to tell your experience as well. Like, you've got a similar book selling experience, I'm sure. And from there, by the time that we sold the book, I had maybe 7 years of research, maybe a little more. So I just had mounds, literally heaps of paper on my floor, organized into rough chapters. Of course, a book proposal lays all that out for you. We sold the book, and I just cleared everything. I quit. Don't ever quit your job when you sell a book, please, friends. But I quit my job, and because all of this writing and research I had done with a full-time job, and I cleared 17 weeks, and I wrote the book in 17 weeks, nonstop. I did nothing else. I saw no one. I ate ramen noodles. I went out for a walk in the morning. I stopped at the deli and got something I could eat that day, and I wrote the book. And it was probably the most satisfying experience I've ever had.
And it came out in 2016. Is
Hmm.
that correct? Which is, it's funny that I hadn't heard of it until recently, like the end of
Yeah.
last year, which is when I was putting together my reading list for this year. I
Mm.
was really surprised, like, how did I not know about this book? But I don't know,
Yeah.
somehow it never was on my radar. But it's even though like life seems very different in 2023 than it felt in 2016, all the issues that you wrote about are
Yes.
still very present, if not even in a more dire place than they were
Yeah.
back in 2016. So
Yeah, I think the book is just dated enough to feel semi-prescient. You know, Jahai McMath case was just taking place, which that discussion of whether brain death is death, which is now quite ascendant. We see, you know, Harvard University and other organizations hosting roundtables to discuss what does Jahai McMath now mean. So there were a number of cases that you know, the PVS diagnosis, just disability issues as they intersect with not just aid in dying, but end of life care and autonomy and consent. So all of those things, everything to me feels as though it's coming to a head in a way that is so sad. But that's where we are. So,
yeah, it at times it feels frightening to me, but I keep looking at the old adage that things get worse before they get better. And
mm,
definitely things I would say have gotten worse, and we're all just hanging on, waiting
yeah.
to see where we're headed. But I wanted to mention that one thing that was really helpful to me, just a second here, my there. Really helpful to me was the discussion that you had with Bill Peace about his perspective as a disability activist around medical aid in dying, because I'd never been able to understand exactly why the disability community was opposed to medical aid in dying. It seemed like something different than what they're experiencing, until I realized like the struggle that patients living with a
Mm,
disability have faced all of their lives. And it even occurred to me the very idea of dignity, how we label what is dignity.
yeah.
And many people would look at the way they live and are, must live because of what they're dealing with, as not dignity and not being a dignified way to have to live. And other people are choosing, I would rather not live if I have to have someone else provide care for me 24/7. And so it really helped me understand that perspective and why he and others in,
Mm.
in his movement feel so strongly about it.
Yeah, but it seems to me, and this is what I hope comes through in the chapter. Bill was very special to me. We had these online, at the time I had a blog, which was just, I didn't know very much. I was throwing things around, and it was a different environment than there is right now, but the habits among people were still the same. So Bill and I were at loggerheads about some things, and he just called me one day or emailed me, I don't recall now. He just got in touch with me on his own and said, let's just talk about this. And I said, yes, let's. And he's like, just come up here for lunch. So I drove up to Port Jervis where he lived, Jervis, like above the city, about an hour, and hung out with Bill. And we went to this lovely Thai restaurant, and we just sat there for hours and talked. And he he told me what he faced as someone who had been disabled since the age of 16 because of a disease, a debilitating disease, being cared for by his mother, getting his PhD, having a son, getting married, getting divorced. And what he wanted me to know was that he had a life and he had autonomy. He was not stupid because he couldn't walk. He was a very intelligent person. And so a lot of the things that he had projected onto me, I was as guilty of projecting onto him. However, Bill's solution, do not legalize aid in dying, and all of this comes out of the Not Dead Yet movement, right, or group. So I just want to say, I think that the majority of the disabled community would say, yes, I would like to make my own medical decisions. Aid in dying makes sense to me. This was a very loud group allied in such a way that they could be amplified across the pro-life movement. And when I say pro-life, it's in air quotes because it's a strategically named movement that covers everything from abortion to aid in dying. So when Bill belonged to the Not Dead Yet organization, he was not a believer per se. He certainly wasn't, going to Catholic mass every week. Like he found himself allied with these groups because he was a useful tool in many ways. And I don't think he was at all naive about that. But the solution that Bill had, don't legalize aid in dying, was misguided. The problem is the lack of rights and autonomy and respect that the disability rights community receives. We are more than 25 years past the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was getting invitations to speak at events that were upstairs, that there was no way for him to get to. And this was just, within the past decade. We know that individuals who have disabilities do not receive the same treatment as others. We know that everyone looks at them as either children or lesser members of society. Almost every, I don't know what the percentage is, but an enormous majority of those who are disabled live in poverty, deep poverty, because they have no way to earn income, because their disability would go away if they did work part-time. It's a tragedy as a society that those with disabilities are treated the way they are. And so the way to solve the problems that Bill faced is not by preventing aid in dying from becoming legal, but by making sure that those individuals have the resources and the wherewithal and the living wage that they deserve. And I think he and I agreed on a whole host of things, but he was very much committed to Not Dead Yet. And I think he had community in that group. And it made me think a lot about how I make community and what decisions that brings me to making. And I loved him very much. And so that started, that one meal started a conversation between the two of us that lasted for a number of years. I have a box right here on my shelf behind me that he gave to me, and he was from the Pacific Northwest originally, and it's carved in these gorgeous Alaskan totems from the Pacific Northwest. He was a teacher. He was an incredible being. But I ultimately still disagree with his position.
Well, I'm impressed that your curiosity took you to the table to be able to sit with someone who disagreed with you and you disagreed with his position, but to just be able to have a civil conversation and to actually get to know one another and value one another, which I feel we desperately need more of that right now in our society. I guess COVID has made it hard for us to have in-person meetings with people, so we've gotten even more separated in a way, but I feel like we need more of these civil conversations about issues that we disagree on.
I don't agree with that about all issues. I think there are a lot of issues that when we bring disparate parties to the table, we're pretending that they all have equal footing, when indeed structurally they do not. So I do have caveats. I think some issues we have allowed parties in power to go beyond what is just, to go beyond what represents equality. So I don't agree with you on all issues. Certainly, policy on how to help elders. We know that a lot of that territory can be covered if we all sit down. We agree on the majority, right? Maybe we don't always agree on how end-of-life policy should be implemented, but there are areas in which I do believe that individuals with ill purpose or vanity are attempting to impose policy on the rest of us to be right, to exact control, to impose an ethics or an ideology that we don't all ascribe to. So respectfully, I disagree.
I understand that. I can agree with that. I think you're exactly right about that, and particularly in around certain issues. But I did have a thought about in talking about the disabled community, that if we were to focus more on making sure that they were treated ethically and equitably and fairly, um, that could make a difference in
Yeah.
these conversations around end of life. And then that seems also true about other marginalized communities. And one thing I see happening in hospice, there's this effort to focus on how do we bring in more people of color who are underrepresented in hospice services, and yet are we trying to get to the end point without doing the basic work that we need to do? Like, don't we need to look at our entire healthcare system? We're dealing with groups of people that have always felt they've received substandard care or been shut out of care or have been exploited
And
by
still are.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about, just look at the mortality rate of Black mothers. Just look at the fact that we've never reckoned with Tuskegee, and that there was never any recompense for those families whose loved ones were either diagnosed with syphilis and never told, just studied, or actually received syphilis injection for study. What about all of the individuals, whether they were women of color, immigrants, or people in mental health institutions who were sterilized? I mean, the American medical community has a lot to reckon with, and it makes absolute sense to me that that individuals of color do not donate organs, do not want to go to the doctor, are quite often not given early diagnoses of cancers or other illnesses, and quite simply do not have access to medicine. So not only have they been pushed out of the medical access area for so long, they were never included in the healthcare recipient community. Yeah, I'm so passionate about this. It makes me incredibly angry. Where sure enough, you and I could sit here and talk about some of the issues that are discussed in regular media, right, about the challenges in healthcare, but the problems are so glaring and so straightforward and obvious. Like, just give people healthcare access. Just figure out why we don't believe that Black women are in pain, or women in general, but particularly Black women. Like, these are the simplest things. And we don't have to have a long conversation about that. There's data everywhere that proves it. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's exactly the same point I'm making, that we have to start at the very beginning to restore trust. You can't walk into someone's home and say, here, sign a form that says you'll forego any curative treatments in order to receive comfort care. Oh, well-intentioned, well-meaning, with compassion, we want to care for you. How is that person able to say, what you're telling me is you're not going to treat me? And I've spent my whole life struggling and trying to get treatment for the issues that I have, and I'm supposed to willingly now just sign it off and say I'm willing to forego treatment. It just doesn't make sense to me. We're at the trying to create a solution at the very end of this chain of
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
issues, and we need to start at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think these issues are, I dreamed I guess about mid reporting of this book, I dreamed of a patient's bill of rights. We've never passed one. It's come and gone as an idea, but it would cover everything from, legalization of cannabis, maybe, to those with disability, to individuals of color in the healthcare system. And we just don't have anything of that sort that can protect just basic rights. And some of these things are just so nonsensical. I've written a lot about nursing homes during the pandemic. So I did a whole series for The Guardian, which was heartbreaking. I did all my reporting before the pandemic, literally the month before the pandemic, in Philadelphia, because it has one of the older Black communities that live in poverty. Just old, one of the oldest communities of color in poverty in the nation, in urban centers. And what I found there was that patients were being bounced out of nursing homes as soon as their Medicare ran out, because the fee schedule drops as soon as you go to Medicaid. And of course, the duration or the number of hours that one receives in a facility varies by state. And so it gets to be very complicated to explain. But as soon as that fee scale decreases, nursing facilities have to keep up a quota. You know, they literally use architecture to divide Medicare and Medicaid patients from one another. They have bed quotas, and they have accountants who come up with formulas on how to keep that balance. We don't tell elders that if you're in a bed, you cannot be evicted from that bed. If you are switching from Medicare to Medicaid, they have to keep you, and nobody knows it. So just that simple, just addressing that bed bouncing horror. I mean, I had ombudsmen in Philadelphia tell me about elders who were evicted from their nursing home to homeless shelters. I just profoundly sad stories of what individuals experience because of that one lack of, because of that one loophole that private equity nursing home facilities could operate on to make more money.
And then because those patients have no advocate to stand up for them or to help protect their rights, they're just victimized. They have no recourse.
Yeah. And I think hospice plays a role here as well. I do think that hospice and nursing home care are part of the same conversation, because hospices are so much in nursing home facilities, but also because so much death and dying took place in nursing homes in the past 2 to 3 years. So those conversations should dovetail in a much more holistic way, and they really don't. But my only point was, I'm sorry, but my only point, Karen, was that there are simple things that could be addressed by policymakers who are astute and asking the right questions and who really want to solve problems. I'm afraid that we're coming into an era where proper governance is really not the point of government. It's more like winning or winning points or winning popularity. And sadly, that has distracted all of us from paying attention to the great but easy fixes we could make to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, so true. And so it turns out being on a case-by-case basis. Maybe if you're fortunate enough to live in a certain community where you have dedicated workers who will stand up for you and who will make sure you get the care you need, or grassroots programs that are being started to reach out to marginalized community. I mean, that's good fortune, but it's certainly it's the beginning of making some changes here and there, but it's not enough, and it's not going to bring sweeping change across the country.
Right, right. I've written a little bit about death doulas, and I love the idea of training individuals to care for end of life. But I kind of feel like, and tell me if you agree, I feel like it is in many ways a distraction, in that we already have a program, Hospice, that should do this. So why aren't we using that? Hospice reaches what, 1.2 million people a year. 50% or something die in hospice, albeit, their hospice stay is far too short. But we have that structure. Why can't we put all of our effort and time into increasing those fee schedules, into overseeing hospice training for both caregivers and volunteers, but also doctors? Why can't we make this a more robust system? Because doulas, if they volunteer for a facility, that's fantastic. But quite often there's an entrepreneurial aspect to the doula model, where these individuals then go out to work with families that can afford them. And that's a real tragedy to me.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's as if we're treating the symptom once again, which is what we're guilty of in healthcare all the time, treating the symptom instead of the underlying issue. And so, well, hospice isn't functioning as well as it could. So let's put a Band-Aid on. Let's create something different to
Right.
try to shore up hospice and to make hospice better, instead of really looking at where the problems arise and making changes there. Yeah, that same mentality is just plaguing all of healthcare right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think in some ways it's a reaction to how how confounding it is to make change. You know, if it were easier to find political will, if it were easier to get the public to talk about some of these issues, if we could actually see a way forward. And so I do think that there are some models that we can use, maybe the movement to legalize aid in dying, or the current movement to address understaffing. I mean, it took a pandemic, understaffing in nursing homes and hospitals, but it took a pandemic to get us to that conversation. I wonder if there are other examples that we could see where there is a successful change. Oh, I think with the aid in dying conversation has come greater interest and use of end-of-life documents like POLST and MOLST forms, or hospice enrollment. We see in any state where aid in dying is legal, hospice enrollment is longer and more prevalent. So there are some examples of things working.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that a shift is underway. It's happening, and we're at that really messy place where where things are falling apart in some ways, possibly getting better in other ways, and we just cannot exactly see where it's headed. I have to stay hopeful, but I will say, like, part of my reason for just wanting to do a podcast and have these conversations is because the more we talk about it, definitely,
Yeah.
the more we bring these issues to light, the more we encourage other people that it's safe to talk about death and dying. It's
Yeah.
safe to think this over and really
Yeah.
dive into these issues. And that's what you've created as well, by the writing that you do and the extensive research that you do. So you're not just writing about superficial issues, you're diving in to the
Yeah.
real heart of where these problems exist, the nitty-gritty, I would say. And I
Thank you.
admire you for that.
Well, likewise. I mean, I think probably your experience is similar to mine in that anytime I open my mouth to address any of this, there are many people who line up and say, I have this question for you. My mother is, or my cousin is. And this book has been out now, what is it, 23? So what's that, 7 years? And I still do a lot of these conversations, have a lot of these, but I also just have a lot of friends and friends of friends. Actually, my partner's ex-wife is a therapist, and one of her clients has a dying grandmother. And so she asked if her client could call me. And this poor young woman is surrounded by brothers and uncles and fathers, and is the one taking care of her grandmother and being told by everyone what she can or can't do and how she needs to do this, and was suffering, just suffering under the pressure, under not knowing what was taking place with her grandmother, not fully understanding the doctors. And all I had to do was say, you're doing the right thing. You're taking care of her. You're doing what they're telling you. She gets a little confused. That's okay. She's talking to people who no longer are alive. Absolutely normal. She's no longer eating and drinking. You don't have to keep feeding her. If she doesn't want it, it's because her body's shutting down. She can't process it anyway. And you have all these people telling you what to do. If they want to dictate how their mother is taken care of, they can come do it. So you are the one who is taking care of her care. You're the one doing the caregiving. You're the one who makes the decisions. She needed that only. That's all she needed. And it was stunning to me to hear this woman who was weeping and crying go from that horrible position of feeling as though she could do nothing right, that her grandmother was going to die and it was going to be her fault because she had done something wrong, to understanding, oh, I can do this because we've done it as human beings for centuries. and and this is my realm. I'm at the bedside and I can make the decisions of what's best for my grandmother because everyone has entrusted me with that. That's all she needed. And that doesn't take great expertise. To say that takes nothing other than a minute of caring about this individual. That's all.
So true. Just the empowerment that comes from that, and just the smallest amount of education and support can make a
Yeah.
huge difference. And we are at a place where that's kind of where we're operating, I guess, in individual cases with our neighbors, our friends and family, and spreading the word as much as we can, but also writing articles and books, doing podcasts together,
Yeah.
and hoping that other people are listening in, that they will continue to spread this kind of information and empowerment to other people.
Yeah. No, I commend your work very much.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I did want to say, so my father died by suicide long ago, back when I was 34, and all of my work was catalyzed by his death, because it was because of my grief over his death that I started volunteering for hospice and became a hospice doctor and started writing books and doing this podcast. All of this work has been began with that experience for me and dealing with my own grief. And I've come to view it as, that the work that we do can give meaning somehow to the life and the death of our loved ones too. I mean, my dad's life had meaning as well for him, but there's even additional meaning in his death because it brought me to this place of doing this work. I don't know if you have any similar feelings about that after your experience.
Um, I love silver lining thinking. I think it's really helpful to us to find the good outcome in a bad situation. But I think it doesn't always exist. I'm just always trying to be a realist about that, because I think because of what we do, hope is so powerful, and it's so easy to slip into vague language that that doesn't answer any questions, solve any problems. So no, I do believe that we make something of grief, or we can make something of grief, of bad experiences, of lost loves and brutal deaths. Yeah, we learn something, and we can often use that. We can be compelled by that to do good things, to learn more. Yeah, but I know this about your biography, and that's a very different situation. I mean, my father was 60, he was young, but suicide is a whole other level of, I mean, first of all, it's accompanied by trauma. And I think anytime that death and trauma are together, you're in a different realm um, than death in later years. So my condolences. I don't care how long ago it was, we still carry it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Still always a factor that's
Yeah.
there.
How old was he?
He was 69.
Yeah. And was it with a gun?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You know, I wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine in 2019 about the pattern in the United States of elder couples who are ending their lives together. And I had been watching this homicide, suicide, spousal homicide, suicide, these cases that are quite often recorded in local news, but nowhere else. And when they are recorded, they're called mercy killings, or Romeo and Juliet. You know, they loved each other so much that they decided to die together. But I think those terms quite often cover a pattern of domestic violence. You know, kind of the penultimate act of domestic violence is a man who feels as though he must care for his wife. They are threatened with being put into a nursing home because the police are called or someone has a fall, and who feels so desperate and incapable of caring for that loved one, that they then usurp their consent, which they've probably done for quite a long time as a spouse, and shoot their wife and then themselves. And quite often it's done, these take place with guns, but there are other weapons that are used as well. There was just a case recently, within the past month, I believe, where a woman, the husband was supposed to do the shooting. I don't know how to talk about this with grace. It's hard to. And and couldn't, and so the wife did, but she survived.
Mm.
And there are elders who are in prison all over the country right now. It happens much more often than we think. And so when we're talking about gun violence, we tend maybe to think of the mass shootings that plague the country, or accidents, or say the ultra-right violence that we're seeing. But I think that just having guns in the home makes our elders much more susceptible. And we could say, well, one or both of them is dead, so it doesn't spread. But in many cases, these take place in facilities. Entire communities are affected, adult children. It's just unsafe. And the individual I wrote about is still a friend. He and his wife used pills, and I think in their case, consent was quite clear. So I just want to point out that there's a spectrum where people feel so helpless in the healthcare system, they can't get the resources they want, or they don't have means to get out. The dying has gone on far too long for not just one of them, but both of them. And so these drastic measures make sense to them. And that's a very clear sign that, again, we're doing something quite wrong.
Yeah, there's something awry and amiss in our society right now, or has been for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Again, another issue that that we need more work on, and we need to look into. But well, we're running out of time, and I just wanted to thank you once again, Anne, first of all, for writing the book, for doing this hard work, 7 years of investigation and interviews and traveling. And it's a really compelling and thought-provoking book, and you've dived into some very challenging issues that we need to be aware of, and we need to be thinking about and talking about. So I want to thank you for writing the book, and thank you for taking time out to talk to me about it.
It was a pleasure, Karen. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed meeting you, and I hope we can stay in touch.
We will.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Anne Neumann. Be sure and subscribe and leave a rating and review for this channel and for the podcast. Thanks again for any of you who go to eoluniversity.com/support to make a small contribution there. And I'll see you the next time with the next conversation.